It was supposed to be a simple weekend event. A yard sale, something most people in my neighborhood did once in a while. I had been decluttering my house for weeks, and it felt like the perfect time to part with some items I no longer needed. Little did I know, this would turn into a battle for my rights, my freedom, and an unexpected war against the neighborhood HOA Karen. As I prepared for the yard sale, I followed the basic rules. I posted a few signs around the neighborhood, kept the sale within the hours allowed by the city, and even made sure not to block anyone's driveway. It was meant to be a low-key, neighborhood-friendly event, but just a few hours into setting up, I felt an unease that I couldn't shake. The strange looks from a few neighbors, the whispers, and then finally, a knock at my door. I opened it to find none other than Karen, the self-appointed HOA enforcer, standing there, clipboard in hand. I could already tell she was going to be a problem. "You're violating the HOA's guidelines," she stated, almost smugly, without a greeting. "You can't hold a yard sale here." I was taken aback. "What do you mean? I'm just getting rid of some old stuff. It's a yard sale, nothing more." Karen's eyes narrowed, and her grip on her clipboard tightened. "You are still in violation. I've received complaints, and you'll need to shut it down immediately." I tried to remain calm. "Complaints? From who? I'm just trying to get rid of some things and make a little extra cash. I'm following all the rules." She didn't budge. "I'll be reporting you to the HOA board. You'll face fines if you don't comply. Consider this your first warning." Before I could even respond, she turned on her heel and walked away, her steps echoing with authority and self-righteousness. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I hadn't done anything wrong. I wasn't blocking any streets or parking spots. Why was Karen so intent on ruining my yard sale? But I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I decided to take a stand. I took a deep breath and went back to setting up, refusing to let her intimidate me into canceling my sale. But Karen wasn't done with me. A few hours later, as I was helping a neighbor load some items into her car, I saw Karen walking toward me again. But this time, she wasn't alone. She was with another neighbor, Mrs. Hall, a woman who had lived on the block for decades and was known for being somewhat of a busybody. Mrs. Hall looked upset, and as soon as she saw me, she scowled. "I've told Karen about your yard sale," Mrs. Hall said. "It's causing too much traffic, and it's a disturbance to the peace of the neighborhood. You should have asked for permission first." I shook my head. "There's no need for permission. Yard sales are allowed, and I've done everything by the book." Karen jumped in. "It doesn't matter. We don't want this kind of activity in our neighborhood. You can't just have a yard sale whenever you feel like it. I'll be reporting this to the HOA, and if you don't shut it down, we'll fine you." I could feel the anger rising in me. How dare they try to shut me down like this? The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like this was all a personal vendetta. Karen and Mrs. Hall didn't like my yard sale, and now they were using their HOA influence to try to ruin it. But they had underestimated me. I wasn't going to let Karen use her HOA position to push me around. I went inside my house, grabbed the HOA's rules and regulations that I had printed out when I first moved in, and marched back outside. I confronted Karen and Mrs. Hall. "According to these rules, yard sales are perfectly legal as long as they don't exceed certain hours, and I've stayed within those guidelines," I said, holding up the paperwork. "You have no grounds to stop me." Karen tried to brush me off. "Those rules are up for interpretation. We don't need to be dealing with people making a mess in our neighborhood." I took a deep breath, feeling the tension building. "If you think you can just shut down my yard sale without cause, I will take this up with the HOA board. I will make sure that this gets exposed. You are harassing me for no reason, and that's not something I'm going to stand for." At that moment, I saw something shift in Karen's eyes. Maybe it was the mention of the HOA board. Maybe it was the idea of being publicly called out. But she didn't seem as confident anymore. Without saying another word, she turned and walked away, Mrs. Hall following closely behind her. I didn't know if this was the end of it or if I was just in the calm before the storm. But at that point, I was more determined than ever to make sure that Karen's power trip didn't succeed. That night, I took it a step further. I gathered testimonials from my neighbors, the ones who had actually enjoyed the yard sale and didn't mind the traffic. I collected evidence of Karen's past complaints and her history of trying to control people's lives in the neighborhood. I was going to make sure I had everything I needed to prove that she was abusing her power. The next day, I walked into the HOA office, ready to expose her. I had my evidence, the complaint she had filed, her false accusations, and her attempts to stop my lawful activity. When I entered the office, I wasn't sure what to expect, but I was prepared for whatever came my way. The board was sitting in their usual meeting room when I entered. I calmly explained the situation, laid out the facts, and presented the evidence. As I finished my presentation, I could see the board members' faces change. They weren't used to Karen's tactics being challenged like this. I wasn't just defending my right to hold a yard sale. I was standing up against her unjust control over the neighborhood. "Karen," I said, turning to her, "you've tried to bully me and my neighbors for far too long. It's time you're held accountable for your actions." I could see Karen's face turn red, her expression turning into one of frustration and defeat. She was used to getting her way, and now she realized that the neighborhood was no longer intimidated by her. The HOA board deliberated for a few moments, and when they returned, they issued a formal apology and confirmed that I was within my rights to hold my yard sale. They also reminded Karen that she couldn't impose her personal opinions or create false complaints about legitimate community events. But the biggest victory was this. Karen was forced to apologize publicly for trying to use her power to shut down my business. She was also stripped of her ability to make unilateral decisions without going through the proper channels. After the board's ruling, there was an undeniable sense of victory in the air, but it wasn't without its consequences. Karen, despite her forced apology, wasn't about to simply accept defeat. She was humiliated, and that humiliation had shifted into something else, anger. The board had made it clear that her actions weren't appropriate, but Karen wasn't the type to let things go easily. She had a long history of using her position as HOA president to enforce rules however she saw fit, and this loss felt like a major blow to her pride. I knew it wouldn't be the last time we'd hear from her. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to feel the effects of the board's decision. For the most part, the community was relieved. People who had been too afraid to speak up about Karen's actions in the past were now openly discussing the changes and the positive impact the new leadership had made. The yard sale had inadvertently united us. We all had a common enemy, and that brought us closer. I even had a few neighbors thank me personally for standing up to Karen, and they made it clear they appreciated the fairness we had now. But Karen wasn't done yet. It started with a passive-aggressive comment on the neighborhood's online forum. She had made sure to mention that there were some things about the recent HOA decisions that just didn't sit right. That was Karen's way of keeping her narrative alive. She wasn't directly attacking me anymore, but her comments were aimed at sowing seeds of doubt. It was obvious she was trying to rally her supporters and create unrest. I had expected this. What I didn't expect, though, was the next step she took. I was getting ready to head out for a meeting one morning when I noticed a letter sticking out of my mailbox. It was from the HOA, but it wasn't the typical communication I had grown accustomed to. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, unsure of what to expect. The letter was from the new board but addressed to Karen, and it was a formal complaint about her actions after the ruling. Apparently, she had been involved in a series of meetings with old board members who had been sympathetic to her cause, and she had been attempting to reformulate rules that hadn't been discussed or approved by the new board. The letter strongly suggested that if Karen continued her attempts to undermine the new HOA, further action would be taken, including a potential removal from any decision-making role within the HOA. This was exactly what I had feared. Karen wasn't going to quietly fade away. She was trying to reassert her power in the background, using the old board members as her allies to regain control. But this time, the neighborhood wasn't going to tolerate it. The letter mentioned the final warning for Karen to respect the board's decision, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of determination. The battle was far from over, but this time, we had the upper hand. I shared the letter with Steve and a few other board members to discuss our next move. We had to act quickly. If Karen's maneuvering was left unchecked, she might succeed in dividing the neighborhood again, and that was the last thing we needed. We quickly decided to call a town hall meeting. This wasn't just for the board to address Karen's actions. It was a chance for everyone in the neighborhood to voice their concerns and reaffirm our commitment to creating a more inclusive, fair HOA. On the day of the town hall, I could sense the anxiety in the air as people filed into the meeting room. It wasn't just about Karen's actions anymore. It was about maintaining the sense of community we had fought so hard to create. I stood at the front, waiting for the crowd to settle. The meeting began with a clear agenda. We would address Karen's attempts to manipulate the HOA, reaffirm the new board's commitment to transparency, and discuss the future direction of the neighborhood. I could see some familiar faces, people who had supported Karen in the past, but they now seemed hesitant, unsure whether to back her in this ongoing saga. The room was divided, but it wasn't as extreme as it had been before. There was hope for a middle ground, but we had to move forward together. As the meeting continued, I spoke to the gathered crowd. We all know the issues that have plagued this neighborhood, but we have to come together as a community, not just to make things work, but to make things better. We can't let one person's personal vendettas affect the way we all live. This is about fairness, respect, and listening to each other. We can't let Karen's actions turn us against one another. The room was quiet for a moment, and then, to my surprise, several neighbors stood up to speak in favor of the new direction the board was taking. They spoke about their frustrations with the old system and how Karen's behavior had created a toxic atmosphere. One by one, voices of support echoed through the room. Karen's attempts to divide us were starting to backfire. However, not everyone was on board. A small group of people who had supported Karen began to voice their objections, but their arguments were weak compared to the growing chorus of voices in favor of change. I could tell that Karen's grip on the neighborhood was slipping. She wasn't the unchallenged leader she had once been, and the community was no longer afraid of her. After the meeting, as people began to leave, I caught sight of Karen standing by the door. She didn't look at me, but I knew she was seething inside. I could almost see the gears turning in her head as she processed the outcome of the meeting. I wasn't sure what her next move would be, but I was ready for it. The following week, things were quieter than I expected. The town hall meeting had made it clear where most of the neighborhood stood, and the support for Karen seemed to have dwindled significantly. She didn't attend any more HOA meetings, and for the first time in months, there was a sense of calm in the neighborhood. People were beginning to move on, resuming their normal lives without the constant anxiety of Karen's heavy-handed rule. But I wasn't naive enough to think that Karen had given up. I knew that she was still plotting something in the background, and it was only a matter of time before she made another attempt to undermine the progress we had made. A few of the neighbors had started sharing their concerns with me. "Karen's not done," one of them said. "She's too proud to let this go. You'll see." I had my own suspicions. Despite the public defeat, Karen wasn't the type to go down without a fight. She was just biding her time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. As the days went on, I kept an eye out, trying to pick up any signs that might point to her next move. Then, one afternoon, I received a strange phone call. It was from Jill, the neighbor who had supported me during the yard sale fiasco. She sounded nervous. "You need to come over here. Now," she said, her voice trembling. "It's about Karen." I immediately grabbed my keys and drove over to her house, not knowing what to expect. When I arrived, Jill was waiting by the door, clearly shaken. "What happened?" I asked, stepping inside. Jill pointed toward her mailbox, where I saw a new letter addressed to her. I picked it up, and my heart sank as I read its contents. It was from Karen. The letter wasn't just a complaint. It was a blatant threat. In the letter, Karen claimed that Jill had violated HOA rules by hosting a gathering in her backyard without proper approval. The letter was full of accusations about loud noise, guests parking in the wrong spots, and other minor infractions that weren't even worth mentioning. The worst part, Karen had demanded that Jill pay a fine or face further consequences. This was a classic move. Karen wasn't going to stop at just me. She was trying to turn the entire neighborhood against anyone who wasn't in her corner. It wasn't about enforcing rules. It was about intimidating people into submission. She was clearly hoping Jill would be too afraid to push back, but I wasn't going to let that happen. "This is exactly what she's been doing all along," I said, shaking my head. "We need to expose this. This is harassment, not a legitimate complaint." I immediately called Steve, one of the new board members. "We've got a problem," I said. "Karen's at it again, and this time she's targeting Jill. We need to act fast before she can get away with it." Steve was just as fired up as I was. "Let's meet tomorrow and figure out how to handle this. We need to put a stop to her once and for all." The next morning, we met with the rest of the board to discuss our strategy. We knew that Karen's influence had faded, but if she continued her campaign of intimidation, the new atmosphere of openness in the neighborhood could easily turn into fear again. We had to put a permanent end to her tactics. I suggested we write a community-wide statement, letting everyone know what Karen was up to and making it clear that we wouldn't stand for this kind of behavior. We also needed to remind everyone about the importance of transparency and fairness. After all, it was the very reason why we had voted out the old HOA leadership in the first place. Steve agreed. "If we don't take action now, she'll just keep trying to undermine us. It's time we make it clear that the neighborhood is no longer under her control." We also decided to make Karen's complaints public, making sure the neighborhood knew exactly what she was doing. We would discredit her accusations by showing how they were based on personal grudges rather than legitimate concerns. We couldn't let her control the narrative any longer. Over the next few days, we worked with the lawyer to draft a formal statement that would go out to every resident. We made sure it addressed Karen's attempts to use the HOA as her personal tool of intimidation, and we reminded everyone of the rights they had as members of the community. The statement was clear, concise, and to the point. We were going to let Karen's false accusations go unchallenged. When the letter was sent out, the reaction from the neighborhood was immediate. People began reaching out to thank us for taking action. They were relieved to know that they didn't have to live in fear of Karen anymore. I also received messages from several residents who had been personally harassed by Karen, some of them for trivial things, like not trimming their bushes the way she liked or parking in the wrong spot. It became clear that Karen had been using the HOA as a way to control people, and the more we uncovered, the more frustrated I became with how she had been allowed to act. As the days passed, Karen's once tight grip on the neighborhood seemed to loosen. The more we stood up to her, the more people began to speak out. It wasn't just me. Everyone who had been affected by Karen's behavior was now joining the fight. The momentum was building, and Karen knew it. She wasn't the uncontested force in the neighborhood anymore, and she could feel the walls closing in. However, I still knew that Karen wasn't someone who would simply give up. The threat of legal consequences had made her retreat for a moment, but I could tell she was preparing for a comeback. It was time for me to prepare for whatever was coming next, and I wasn't about to let her intimidate me or the rest of the neighborhood again. The weeks that followed felt like a slow-motion battle. Karen wasn't one to give up easily, and I knew that despite the board's actions and the community's support, she would find a way to get back at us. But I wasn't backing down either. Every day, I kept reminding myself that we were fighting for something bigger than just one person's vendetta. We were fighting for fairness, for transparency, and for a community that didn't have to live in fear of a bully. But then, Karen made her move. One afternoon, I received an unexpected letter. This time, it wasn't from the HOA or the board. It was from a law firm. I could feel my stomach drop as I opened the letter. Inside was a formal legal complaint. Karen was suing me for defamation and for the damage she claimed was done to her reputation after our public revelations. She accused me of spreading false information and causing her emotional distress. I felt a surge of disbelief. This was her move now. After all the false accusations she had made, and after the way she had tried to shut down my business, she was now the one claiming to be the victim. It was outrageous. But as I read through the document, I realized that Karen was serious. She wasn't just trying to harass me anymore. She was trying to drag me through a legal mess that could cost time and money. I immediately called my lawyer, and we scheduled an emergency meeting. The more I thought about it, the more I realized what Karen was really trying to do. She wasn't just trying to get back at me. She was trying to disrupt the momentum we had created in the neighborhood. If she could draw me into a lengthy lawsuit, it would drain my energy and resources, leaving me distracted from the bigger fight we were all in. During the meeting with my lawyer, I learned a valuable lesson. Karen's legal action was a classic intimidation tactic. She didn't expect to win in court, but she did expect to create enough pressure for me to back down. The more I thought about it, the more I understood her strategy. She was playing dirty, trying to use the legal system as a weapon. I wasn't about to let her win. I decided that the best course of action was to fight fire with fire. We would counter her lawsuit by filing a motion of our own, a defamation suit against her for trying to ruin my reputation with her baseless complaints. I also knew that we needed to gather more support from the community, especially from those who had witnessed Karen's previous actions. I reached out to Steve and the rest of the board. We knew this wasn't going to be an easy fight, but we also knew that we couldn't let Karen's antics go unchallenged. The board had to make it clear that we were not backing down. We decided to document everything, every complaint Karen had made, every interaction she had with residents, and every attempt to undermine the changes we had fought for. In the meantime, I continued to get messages from other neighbors, some of whom had been too afraid to speak up earlier. They were now offering their support, ready to testify in my defense. These weren't just minor complaints, they were testimonies of harassment, stories of Karen using her power to intimidate, bully, and manipulate. We knew that, if this case went to court, the community would stand behind us. But as we prepared for the legal battle, I couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the entire neighborhood's future, about making sure that no one would ever be able to use the HOA as a tool of oppression again. But Karen wasn't going to make it easy. I knew that this fight would require time, effort, and patience, and I wasn't sure how long I would have to keep this up. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let her destroy everything we had worked for. The tension in the neighborhood began to mount again. People who had once enjoyed the calm and unity we had achieved were starting to feel the pressure of Karen's lawsuit. She wasn't just targeting me. She was threatening the peace we had fought to rebuild. But instead of backing down, the neighborhood rallied together, united in our commitment to protect what was right. People started to speak out against Karen more openly. They were no longer willing to sit in the shadows while she bullied others into submission. One evening, I received a message from Jill again. This time, she was in distress. She had heard from a few neighbors that Karen was going door to door, trying to convince people that the lawsuit was a way for her to restore order in the neighborhood. She was making it sound like she was the victim in all of this, claiming that I had lied about her and slandered her character. The audacity of it all. Karen wasn't even hiding her manipulations anymore. She was trying to divide the community once more, using the public perception as a weapon. But the more she tried to spin her story, the more people started to see through her tactics. I received several messages from neighbors saying they were aware of her attempts to twist the narrative and were ready to step up as witnesses for me if needed. But what worried me most was the effect this was having on the rest of the neighborhood. The divide was growing, and I could sense that Karen was digging in her heels, unwilling to back down, no matter what. I realized then that we weren't just fighting for fairness anymore. We were fighting for the soul of the neighborhood. Karen's actions had begun to tear at the fabric of the community, and I couldn't just sit by and let that happen. So, I decided to take things one step further. I wanted to openly expose Karen for what she truly was, a manipulator, a bully. Someone who used her power to control others for her own personal gain. It was time to take public action and ensure that the neighborhood knew the truth. The first step was a community-wide letter. I worked with Steve and other board members to draft a statement that would go out to every resident. The letter was clear, direct, and to the point. We were standing by our actions, and Karen's efforts to undermine the HOA were nothing but an attempt to regain control. We also included a call for unity, urging everyone in the neighborhood to come together and stand firm in the face of Karen's harassment. The next morning, I felt a sense of resolve like never before. We had everything we needed: evidence, support, and most importantly, a community that was ready to move forward. The day after we sent out the letter, the response from the community was overwhelming. Neighbors who had been quietly intimidated by Karen's behavior for so long were finally speaking up. Some residents who had previously kept their distance from the HOA's internal drama were now stepping forward, offering their support and even sharing their own experiences with Karen's heavy-handed tactics. It felt like the tide was truly turning. The community was no longer afraid of her. They were standing with us, and it was becoming evident that Karen's control over the neighborhood was slipping. But with every ounce of power that Karen lost, She fought harder to reclaim it. She started making direct threats, not just against me, but against others who had come forward to support the changes. One evening, I received a phone call from Steve, sounding more anxious than usual. Karen's been telling people she's going to start sending fines to anyone who voted for the new board. She's claiming she has a legal right to do so, and people are starting to get scared. It was frustrating to hear that Karen was still using the HOA's influence to try and intimidate people, even though she had lost her position of authority. I immediately knew we had to take action again. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the entire community's freedom. We couldn't allow her to keep manipulating the HOA rules to her advantage. I called a meeting with the board again. We needed to act swiftly and decisively. There was no more time for waiting. We had to stop Karen from using the HOA to create fear and division. The first step was to publicly expose her threats and make sure the entire neighborhood knew what she was trying to do. We couldn't let her continue using the HOA as her personal weapon. We also decided it was time to start reforming the HOA from the inside. Karen's influence had been so strong for so long that it was clear we needed to establish more clear boundaries for what the board could and couldn't do. I pushed for the creation of community guidelines that would outline exactly how complaints were to be handled. No more random fines, no more intimidation tactics. We needed to make sure the HOA was for the benefit of the entire community, not just for the select few who were able to use it to their advantage. The next few weeks were filled with preparation and strategy. I worked with the board members, Steve, and other supportive residents to ensure we had everything we needed to make the changes permanent. We were ready to present our case to the neighborhood. The goal was clear: to make it impossible for anyone to misuse the power of the HOA again. Then, the night before the community-wide meeting, I received a text from Jill. Karen's at it again. She's been meeting with the lawyer again. She's talking about trying to overturn the board's decisions. My heart sank. Karen was not backing down, and it seemed like she was doubling down on her last-ditch effort to regain control. I couldn't believe it. Even though the majority of the neighborhood had already spoken out against her, she was still trying to create chaos and disrupt the progress we had made. But this time, I was ready for her. We had gathered enough support, and we had prepared our case. We weren't going to let her undermine the changes we had worked so hard for. When the meeting finally arrived, the room was filled with anxious energy. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up in the past were now sitting in the front rows, determined to support the changes and ensure Karen couldn't take control again. The lawyer's letter was passed around, and we made sure to address every false accusation Karen had made, as well as her attempts to bully others. I stood up and began to speak. We've reached a crucial point in this neighborhood's history. Karen's actions have been nothing short of manipulative and divisive, and we can no longer allow her to disrupt our lives. We've seen what happens when a single person tries to wield power over an entire community. We've all lived through it, and we all deserve better. But this isn't just about Karen anymore. It's about the future of this community. We are here to create a space where we work together, not against each other. There was a brief silence, and then, one by one, residents began to speak up. They shared their experiences of being intimidated by Karen, how she had used the HOA's rules to control them, and how they had been afraid to stand up for themselves. The stories poured out, and I could see Karen shrinking in her seat. She was no longer the forceful presence in the room. The power had shifted, and it was clear she was no longer in control. By the time the meeting ended, the board had agreed to implement new policies to prevent any future abuse of power. The community guidelines were approved, and we made sure to include a provision that would allow for immediate removal of any board member who tried to use their position to bully or intimidate others. It was a huge victory, but I knew it wouldn't be the last time we'd have to deal with Karen. She wasn't someone who would just go away quietly, but now, at least, the neighborhood had the tools it needed to keep her in check. As the meeting adjourned and the neighbors began to leave, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't just a victory over Karen. It was the sense of unity that had come from this whole experience. We had stood up together, not just for the neighborhood, but for each other. And in doing so, we had proven that no one person should have the power to dominate the lives of others. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were on the right path. The neighborhood was no longer Karen's playground. It was ours. The following days were a whirlwind of victory and tension. With the board's new decisions in place, the neighborhood felt more like a community again. The oppressive atmosphere that Karen had fostered for so long had lifted, and people seemed more open to interacting with one another, more willing to share their concerns and ideas for the future. It felt like the changes we'd fought for were starting to take hold. But in the back of my mind, I knew Karen wasn't finished. She might have been temporarily sidelined, but she wasn't one to take rejection lying down. I could sense that she was still simmering with resentment, and I couldn't help but wonder if she was planning her next move. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that Karen would find another way to get back into control. One evening, as I was walking my dog through the neighborhood, I saw Karen again. She was standing by her front yard, talking to a few of her old supporters. The look on her face was one of fury and determination, and as she saw me approach, I could tell that she was barely holding it together. I didn't want to engage with her, but I could feel the tension in the air, so I did the only thing I could think of. I kept walking, pretending not to notice her. But Karen wasn't one to let things slide. She called out as I walked past. "You think this is over, don't you? This isn't finished," she yelled, her voice sharp and filled with bitterness. I didn't stop walking. I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of a confrontation, but her words lingered in my mind long after I'd left her property. I knew that she was right. It wasn't over yet. That night, I decided to gather my thoughts. I needed to prepare myself for whatever Karen might try next. I wasn't naive. She was dangerous when cornered, and it was clear she would stop at nothing to regain her influence. But I wasn't about to let her win again. The next day, I met up with Steve and the other board members to discuss the next phase of our plan. We needed to ensure that Karen's influence didn't seep back into the HOA, and that meant we had to be proactive, not just reactive. We discussed putting clearer boundaries in place, making it impossible for any single person to wield the kind of power Karen had. We also discussed forming a stronger network of communication between neighbors, ensuring everyone was kept in the loop and had a say in the decisions that affected them. The HOA had to be a true community, not a playground for one person's ego. But just as we were getting into the details of our new approach, I received another message. This time, it was from Jill, the neighbor who had been so supportive throughout this whole ordeal. She sounded panicked. "You need to come over," she said urgently. "It's Karen." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my car keys and drove over to her house as fast as I could. When I arrived, Jill was waiting outside, visibly shaken. "What happened?" I asked, trying to stay calm despite the rising panic in my chest. Jill pointed to the end of the street. I followed her finger and saw a group of people gathered around, talking animatedly. The tension was palpable. "Karen has been going door to door again," Jill said quietly. "She's telling everyone that she's going to take legal action against the HOA. She says that the decisions we made weren't legitimate and that we're all going to be in trouble for allowing it to happen." My heart sank. Karen was trying to turn the entire neighborhood against us again. She wasn't just stoking the fires of division. She was now playing the victim card, claiming that the new board was illegally elected and that our changes were unconstitutional. I didn't know how much of her story was true, but it didn't matter. This wasn't about facts. It was about manipulating people's emotions. Karen was trying to create doubt in the minds of everyone who had supported us, hoping to weaken the trust we had built. I walked over to the group of people gathered at the end of the street. Some of them were neighbors I knew. Others were people I hadn't met before. They were all listening intently to Karen, hanging on her every word. It was clear that she was doing what she did best, spreading fear and undermining trust. I didn't hesitate. I stepped forward, my voice loud and clear. "I know what's happening here. Karen's spreading lies again. She's trying to make everyone believe that what we've done is illegal. But let me assure you, everything the HOA board has done is within the law. We're not here to control anyone's lives. We're here to make sure this community works for everyone, not just one person's interests." The crowd started to murmur. Some looked uncertain, others seemed curious. I knew this wasn't going to be easy, but I had to make sure Karen's manipulations didn't go unchecked. We've worked hard to make sure this neighborhood is fair and open to everyone, I continued. We've removed the old power structures that allowed people to control others for their own benefit. Don't let Karen convince you that we're doing something wrong. We're doing what's right for all of us. As I spoke, I could see some people starting to nod. The doubt Karen had planted was beginning to fade, and in its place, I could see a sense of resolve building in the crowd. They didn't want to be part of her drama anymore. They wanted a neighborhood that was peaceful, supportive, and most importantly, fair. After I finished speaking, the crowd dispersed, but I could see the change. Karen's supporters weren't so sure of her anymore. Some of them even came up to me to apologize for doubting the board's decisions. It was a small victory, but it was one that would help us move forward. As the days passed, I could feel the momentum shifting in our favor. Karen was no longer the unquestioned leader she had once been. Her supporters were seeing through her manipulation, and the community was coming together to make sure we stayed on the right path. But Karen, being who she was, wouldn't go quietly. I knew that this wasn't over yet. The battle wasn't won, but we had made progress, and that's all I needed to keep fighting. The quiet after the community meeting was almost deceptively calm. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Karen's influence was waning, and the neighbors who had been intimidated by her were now speaking out. It was a victory of sorts, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling at the back of my mind. I knew better than to assume Karen was out of the game for good. She had been a master manipulator for so long, and I couldn't imagine her simply accepting defeat. A few days after the town hall, I received another strange phone call, this time from Steve. His voice was tight with urgency. "You need to hear this," he said. "I got wind that Karen's been making calls to the lawyer again. She's not finished." My stomach dropped. I had expected this, but hearing it confirmed still sent a chill down my spine. Karen was desperate, and I knew she wouldn't stop until she had taken back some semblance of control. The question now was, what was her next move? I called a meeting with the rest of the board. It was time to discuss what we were going to do next. We couldn't afford to wait around and hope Karen would give up. She had shown us that she was capable of anything when it came to holding on to power. We needed to be proactive, or we would risk losing everything we had worked for. After discussing a few options, we decided on a strategy. We would continue to gather support from the community, but this time, we would also take the initiative and make sure the HOA was being run the way it was supposed to be, fairly and transparently. This would involve a stronger emphasis on neighborhood events where everyone could contribute and feel included. It wasn't just about keeping Karen out. It was about building something stronger that she couldn't tear down. We worked together to organize a community event, an informal gathering where people could meet each other, voice their concerns, and learn more about the HOA's new direction. We invited everyone, especially those who had been on the fence, unsure of which way to lean. We didn't just want to create division. We wanted to unite the neighborhood, to show that we were all in this together. When the day of the event came, I could feel the weight of the task ahead of us. We set up in the community center, and people slowly started to trickle in. There was an air of curiosity, but also caution. This wasn't just another HOA meeting. This was about building trust, something that Karen had long eroded. As the crowd gathered, I took the stage and began by welcoming everyone. "We're here today not to talk about the past, but to look ahead to the future," I said, my voice steady. "This is your community, and we're here to make sure that we all have a say in how things go forward. We've made changes, and we're committed to ensuring that they benefit everyone." The energy in the room shifted as I spoke. People were no longer guarded or skeptical. They were listening, and they were starting to understand that the HOA wasn't the enemy anymore. It had become a platform for us all to work together. One by one, residents spoke up. Some shared their frustrations about past HOA leadership. Others expressed their hopes for a more inclusive future. It was a moment of unity, and I could feel the collective energy growing. It wasn't just about fighting Karen anymore. It was about creating something that was ours, not controlled by one person, but led by the community. As the event came to a close, Steve and I exchanged looks. The response had been overwhelmingly positive, and the feedback we received was encouraging. We weren't just winning over hearts and minds. We were building a new foundation, one that Karen couldn't manipulate anymore. I went home that night feeling hopeful, but my sense of peace was short-lived. The very next morning, I received another phone call. This time, it was from one of the residents who had attended the event. "I think Karen's back to her old tricks," she said, sounding concerned. "She's been knocking on doors again, trying to talk people into signing a petition to undo the changes the HOA made." I felt a wave of frustration. How was Karen still managing to undermine our progress? We had worked so hard to build trust, and now Karen was trying to recruit people to turn back the clock. I couldn't let this slide. I had to be proactive again, but this time, I knew we couldn't just rely on meetings or community events to fight Karen's influence. This was going to take a different approach. I quickly called Steve and the board. "Karen's trying to undermine our progress by gathering support for a petition. We need to do more than just talk. We need to make sure people know what's at stake." We agreed that the next step was to counter her petition with our own. But we weren't going to just counter her claims. We were going to expose her tactics and make sure everyone in the neighborhood knew what she was doing. We would make sure that everyone who had supported the new HOA leadership would have the opportunity to stand up and show their commitment to the changes. This wasn't about winning one battle. It was about winning the war for the soul of the community. If you've enjoyed this story and want to see how the fight for control of the neighborhood unfolds, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more updates. Your support helps us keep bringing you these stories, and we've got plenty more exciting battles ahead. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a situation where someone tried to control your neighborhood or community. How did you handle it? Thanks for watching, and don't forget, stand up for what's right.